Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 15 years of law enforcement analysis experience. In addition, he has 10 years selling to law enforcement. After studying geography and environmental science from the University of Maryland at Baltimore County, his journey includes stops at the Washington-Baltimore HIDTA, Alexandria PD, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, LexisNexis, and now Multitude Insights. His three main passions include leadership, law enforcement, and sales. Yes, the day has finally arrived. Please welcome my good friend and mentor, Mr. Joe Ryan. Joey, how we doing?
What's up, Jay? Hey, thanks for that great introduction. And your mentor, huh? I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, this has been a long time coming. Mindy actually thought that I had some kind of conspiracy or beef with you because she's like, why has Joe Ryan not been on the show yet?
A minute there, I was kind of with Mindy. I was wondering what was going on because wasn't I like a pilot episode when you were kind of brainstorming this podcast at some point?
Yeah, we went back and forth, and you've been my advisor in many ways throughout the years, but yes, with the podcast as well. So I'm really excited. It's obviously the holiday season, and this is a great gift. I am glad to finally be sitting down with you and getting your contributions and perspectives in law enforcement analysis. For the listeners, we have a special call-in segment, Ask Joe. You can ask Joe any question that you want. So if you have a question for Joe, get it in now. All right, Joe. How did you discover the law enforcement analysis profession?
Jay, I would love to tell you that I had a traditional path. I always kind of wanted to be an analyst or wanted to work in law enforcement and maybe did great in school and got a bachelor's in criminal justice and a master's in criminal justice and then just went right into it. That was not my story. So in high school, I was kind of a loser when it came to doing well in school. I was an athlete, so all I cared about was getting decent enough grades to play my sport. And I figured I would get a scholarship to play in college. And after a few injuries and stuff, that didn't work out. And so then here I am as a senior in high school, not really get enough grades to make it into college and kind of wasted those years in high school. And I said, well, I'll go to community college, and just because some of my friends were. And I decided not to go to classes and thought I was getting over on somebody. I was really just getting over on myself. So obviously failed out of that and decided, well, you know what? I'll work in a bakery. So I worked in a bakery for 7 years. And one thing that a lot of people don't know about a bakery, it's hard work. It's very hard labor, and you're working long hours, and it's hot in a bakery. And after working there for 7 years, I was really done with that. And I said, I can do something with my brain. I know I didn't apply myself in high school. Let me go back to college, right? And so my parents are really blue collar. And so when I told my mom, I'm going to give up this good job at the bakery, making $30,000 with tons of overtime and all that, my mom's like, you're crazy. Why would you go back to school? You got a good job. And I said, well, because I want to do something with my brain. I want to do something that I enjoy. I want to really love going to work every day. And so I ended up at Carroll Community College in Westminster, Maryland. And I had an instructor in Geography 101 named Carol Rabenhorst. And she was so awesome. She was excited about geography, taught us that geography is not just knowing the capital of various states and countries, but it's really about spatial relationships, right? And how you can use maps and cartography to understand problems in the world. And it just so happened that her husband ran the cartography lab at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and his name was Tom Rabenhorst. And so after taking that first class in community college, I said, you know what? I want to go to University of Maryland, Baltimore County, the Retrievers. I don't know if you saw them in the Final Four a few years ago, or Sweet 16, whatever it was. But I knew I wanted to go there and study geography and really make maps. That was what I was interested in. I always had an interest in maps. And so I ended up at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and started working in the cartography lab, making maps, doing cool stuff. I met some awesome people like Kevin Armstrong and his wife Holly, and Jack, who now works at the HIDA there, Jack Cyborg.
Yeah.
So it was a great time of really learning. And I had an advisor there that sat me down kind of my senior year, the start of my senior year. And he said, Joe, it's great that you have this interest in maps and GIS, but don't just do maps and GIS for the sake of that. Like, find something you're passionate about and apply that. And then I said, well, crap, I'm not really passionate about it. I don't know what to apply the mapping to. And so it just so happened I took a human geography course with Keith Harries. And I was very fortunate because Keith Harries is one of the world's leading crime geographers. And he really inspired me to do something in the world of crime geography. So as my project to finish out that class, I got a bunch of data from Baltimore City, a bunch of crime data, which fortunately they have a lot of. And I was able to get that on a map and start doing some rudimentary analysis with that. And so it just so happened that when my senior year was almost up, Keith Harries walks by my desk and he drops a job posting for the Washington Baltimore HIDA on my desk and says, you might be interested in this. And sure enough, I went and interviewed with a fellow named Jeff Gersh down at the Washington Baltimore HIDA. And it was, I fell into the role. And so my job was to map hotspots for the state of Maryland. So there were 26 hotspots in Maryland. It was a grant funded position. They would send me crime data, and then I would have to put that on a map and create reports for this grant that would go back out to each of these hotspots. And the crazy part was that the data would come in so many different formats. It was such a great first job, Jay, because when you're an analyst, I think like in college, when you do mapping and stuff like that, they give you perfect data sets. You never have to like figure things out. And here I'm getting data from the state of Maryland. In some cases, it's a hard copy table. In some cases, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Some formats I didn't recognize or understand. And I had to figure out how to get all that data into one common format so I could use GIS to solve this problem. So it was a really roundabout way that I got into law enforcement analysis, but that's the beauty, I think, of our profession, right? Of the crime analysis profession, is that people you talk to come from all different backgrounds, and I'm sure you've experienced that with this podcast. You got former dispatchers, you got people that wanted to do this from the day they started, you got people who never imagined, and I was one that never imagined I would be a crime analyst, and I just fell into it and I fell in love with it.
So either in college or at HIDA, what was the earliest version of GIS that you worked on?
The earliest one I can remember on the Esri side was ArcView 3.1. Okay. But I'm pretty sure there was a version before that I was using. But I remember like really sinking my teeth into ArcView 3.1. Okay. But at the HIDA, we didn't use Esri. We used Map Info, which our buddy Kevin called Crap Info.
Yep.
But it wasn't a bad solution. It did everything that the Esri tools did. It was just a little different in the way it went about things. And so I got pretty good with Map Info there. And what I would always tell people when they were learning GIS and maybe they weren't on the right platform or they wanted something different, it's like, learn the techniques, learn what can be done with the solution, and then you can apply other solutions with it. So in college, I did a internship with Howard County government where I was mapping out parcels and I was using an Intergraph GIS solution. And so like the idea was, if you knew what GIS could do for you, it really didn't matter the exact tool that you were using at the time. You just had to figure out how to do it in one versus the other.
Yeah. And I remember trying to clean that data, and just back then we didn't have YouTube to just search to find out how you clean data or anything else. So sometimes you were either trying to get creative or it was just line by line, trying to maybe a find and a replace. It was a lot of effort to try to get all that data formatted in a similar fashion to get it loaded to the program.
I tell you, Jay, I think for a new analyst, I think this still applies today. The cheat code is getting to conferences and networking, right? Because you and I would be at the HIDA and we'd be butting our heads against the wall with a challenge that we had. And then we'd go to like an NIJ MAPS conference, or we go to IACA conference, and we'd see a session where somebody had figured that out. And we go up
Yeah.
and talk to them, and you have access to people. It's not like when you go to like some event and the keynote speaker won't talk to you because they're so big and popular and famous. No, it's just a crime analyst from Sheboygan. And you go up and you talk to them and you're like, hey, I need help doing this. And it looks like you figured that out. Sure, here's my email. Let's talk next week. And so the community has always been great about helping people. And this goes back to the days of Sean Bair and Dan Helms and Noah Fritz and Rachel Boba, people from the beginning in crime analysis that would go to these conferences and present not for their own egos, but to help raise raise all ships. And that's where the field really had a boom, I think.
Yeah, and there was so many analysts that were either individual or maybe one partner there at the police department, and you're just told to figure it out. So there was a need to network, right? You had to go out, like you get the listservs, or you get on some kind of email string to where I'm like, okay, I have this problem. Has anybody else figured it out? And so I think that idea of networking came out of necessity, that it wasn't an established profession. It wasn't, everything wasn't in a recipe book that you just pulled off the shelf. A lot of this stuff we were figuring out for the first time.
Yeah, and the academic community helped a lot too, Jay. Like, I think about our time at the HIDA. I didn't get a chance to interact with him much, but right before I got there, John Eck was like an advisor to the
Yeah.
HIDA. And one of the things that he implemented was a way to identify open air drug markets with mapping. And the secret sauce there that he applied was you can't just use drug calls for service, because you have some drug calls for service that are like, hey, there's 4 guys standing out on a street corner, they must be dealing drugs, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just use drug arrests, because the police department can manipulate that, right? They can go out and target a certain area for proactive activity, and that appears to be where the drug market is. And sometimes it's right, and sometimes maybe it's not. But when you combine those two elements together, drug calls for service and drug arrests, and put them into the same data layer, now all of a sudden you start to uncover where the drug markets are. And John had done that throughout Baltimore and some other places when we were at the HIDA. And it just got me thinking, like, hey, this data that we're working with in its own, it's not completely pure. Sometimes we got to think through the problem and understand. It's like, how many times has an analyst done work with any kind of calls for service, and if they're inexperienced, they show a map or they show statistics and they hand it to somebody and they're like, oh yeah, of course the hospital has the most calls for service, or of course the police station has the most calls for service. And so there's those little subtleties that you have to learn about data in policing that, fortunately for me, like, I was able to see the work of John Eck and kind of pattern that and mirror that. And we get the same thing when we network and talk to other people. It's like, hey, you dummy, you can't include the police station in a call for service analysis.
Yeah, I remember the one time I did a call detail analysis, and I had this one number that was really popular, and it ended up being the pizza joint. But John Eck, he was actually the one that turned me to the Washington Baltimore HIDA, because I was his student in graduate school in 2001, and didn't want to take any more classes. So I said, I'm looking for an internship, and I want to go to the Baltimore, Washington area. And he said, hey, I have a connection there. So that's where the email that I still have to this day, Dear Mr. Joe Ryan, and our relationship started from there.
Jay, I'll never forget that, because you reached out, you got a master's degree in criminal justice or criminology from Cincinnati, and you're like, yeah, I want to come intern with you with this summer. And I'm like, oh man, it'd be great to get this guy, but we can't pay interns right now. We're at a point where the budget's tight or whatever. And so I said, well, too bad. But I replied back. I said, hey, you look great. Love to have you. Can't afford to pay you. And you're like, that's okay. I'll come work for free. And I'm like, this guy's crazy. But you worked the whole summer.
We have to have him, man. If he's driving from Baltimore for free, now he's got to be studied.
I'm like, this guy's nuts. So you came and you worked the whole summer with us, and we knew right when we started working with you, like, you were dedicated, you were, going to be a really good analyst. And so when an analyst position opened up, we plopped you right in there.
Yeah, it was definitely put me on the right path. So, all right. Well, hey, this actually leads us to one of your analyst badge stories. And for those that may be new to the show, the analyst badge story is the career defining case or project that an analyst works. And so for you, it's the year 2002 and you're dealing with gang maps.
Yeah. It was, I tell this story quite a bit, maybe on my LinkedIn or different places. But to me, this story was so important to my understanding of my role, right?
Hmm.
Because when we get some training and some skills and we can use GIS and we can manipulate data a little bit, we think, hey, we got the answers. But
Hmm.
then you got all the people that are out there in the field that really have a lot of the answers too. And how do we get those two sides to work together? And so I'm sitting in my office at the Haida one day, and Frank Morgan walks in from the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. And if you don't know Frank, he's a very excitable guy. And once he gets on a topic, he's like a dog on a bone. And he's like, yeah, let's go, let's go. So he comes in, and he's like, Joe, I got this great idea. I got this great idea. I'm like, yeah, what is it, Frank? He's like, I want you to map out every gang area in Washington, D.C., put it on a map, their territory, and then we can use that for some analysis. And I'm like, man, Frank, that's a great idea. And he's like, well, when can you have the map done? And I said, well, when can I have the data? He said, data? What are you talking about? I said, well, I have no idea where these gang areas are. So we have to get that information. Like, and he's like, well, how do I do that, Joe? And so I think for a minute and I said, I tell you what, we got that big plotter over there. Let's print out a plotter size map of Washington, D.C. with all the streets labeled, as many as we can, all the PSAs, police service areas, the districts. And then you go out there, you meet with the gang unit, you meet with the investigators, you meet with the officers in each of those districts. And while you're talking to them, draw the polygon on the map. Like, let them help you draw these polygons. Draw a line from the polygon. In cartography, we call it a leader line. Draw it from the polygon to the side of the map or the margins, and then write in the attributes you want to collect, like leader name, colors, propensity for violence, weapon of choice, whatever you want to write in there. But keep it consistent across all of them. And so Frank's like, okay, Joe, okay, I'm going to do it. And he rolls up the map and he leaves our office. And Kevin was in the meeting with me, Kevin Armstrong, and we're thinking, we're not going to see this guy ever
Yeah.
again. Well, sure enough, 3-4 months later, he comes back in. He unrolls this map. It's got coffee stains all over it. It's ripped. But he's marked up the whole thing with gang areas all through Washington, D.C.
Nice.
And what we did is, so it's not just my badge story, it's really Kevin's too, because Kevin took that and digitized that into a GIS layer. It actually made the Esri map book where it shows all of the gang territories in Washington, D.C., and had a whole bunch of attributes behind it in that GIS layer that we were able to use to overlay crime data, look at things like assaults in and around gang areas where you may have rival gangs, things like that. And Kevin, for as long as he was at the Haida, would update that every year. So that thing lasted over a decade for sure, where they would use that for analytical purposes. And I remember thinking, like, this was my first big success story because we were able to gather information from the heads of the officers, the detectives who were out there working and understood the street. We were just a bunch of nerds behind the computer,
Yeah.
right? But we were able to take all that good intelligence and then turn it into a usable product that we used for years there to look at different attributes of violent crime. So to me, that was incredibly valuable. I love telling people about that because there's probably examples today where if you're an analyst and you're sitting in your chair, there's probably ways that you could work better with the patrol officers and the detectives to understand more of what's happening on the street and then enhance your products.
Yeah. As listening to that, I wish I would have listened to that story a little bit more because getting end user buy-in and getting them to participate is a big part of that story. And there's been plenty of times in my career where I didn't follow that and the project struggled.
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, I don't think I would have been successful going out to the districts in DC, but
Hmm.
Frank had the relationship. And oftentimes as an analyst, you have to be, that's again back to networking. You have to use the people around you to help you. If you go to roll calls and try to gather that type of information, they're not going to be very receptive.
Hmm.
Find that sergeant over the street crimes unit or whoever it is you're in tight with who does have the respect of the guys and gals in the field and have them work with you on a project. And oftentimes you'll be more successful.
Oh, I could talk hours on our time with the Washington Baltimore Haida, but I am going to move on because you do make the decision to go to the police foundation. And so I'm curious as you look back now, just what went into that decision, and we'll get into some of the stuff that you did at the police foundation.
Yeah, so after being at the Haida for about 4 or 5 years, I enjoyed that job a lot, but I was ready for a new challenge. And Rachel Boba was leaving the crime mapping lab at the Police Foundation, and the name had just changed to Crime Mapping and Problem Analysis Laboratory. And Rachel Boba had her PhD at the time. She was going
Yeah.
to teach, become a professor. And I was like, this is a crazy long shot. You ever have one of those things in your career that you're like, I'll just apply for, but there's no way I'm going to get it?
Yep.
Well, it just so happened that their evaluation method for that position was to have someone come in and do an in-person training on problem analysis, crime and problem analysis. And that just happens to be something that I was pretty good at. Well, I came in and I gave a presentation, and apparently I killed it, and they loved it. And so I was hired there to run the crime mapping and problem analysis laboratory. I worked closely with Greg Jones, who's a great guy. Him and I had a great relationship, and it was about keeping the crime mapping news going. But when I came in, I had a plan. They had talked to me about training and upping the crime analysis game throughout the country. So Greg and I developed a plan to go train 700 analysts. We were going to have like a remote laptop lab where we were going to come on site and train a bunch of people. And I mean, we sketched out this whole plan. And when I met with my grant monitor at the COPS office, the grant monitor said, "Oh, okay, I think I'd prefer you to write publications." And I understand why he said that, because Rachel had just left there. Rachel was writing publications, all that type of thing. But that's not my skill set, writing publications. And in fact, maybe I'm different, but I even told him, I'm like, look, I like Rachel. I have a lot of respect for her. I'll sit through a presentation of hers any day. I'm not reading publications. I'm too busy, like as an analyst. I don't read a lot of publications. I'll read a summary of them or some best practices or sit through a presentation, but I don't think there's as much value as me getting out there and teaching people how to do crime analysis. Well, he disagreed. So it was kind of an uncomfortable spot for a couple of years because it wasn't my strong suit, but it did give me the ability to reach out to like Jerry Ratcliffe and some people who do write publications and say, hey, how about you help me with a publication, and by help me, you write it. And so with Jerry, he wrote that publication about crime analysts and intel analysts.
Yes.
And it was like a lot of people don't know what went on behind the scenes of that, but him and I actually went to the IALEA conference, and we talked to the board of intel analysts, and we talked to the board of crime analysts, and a whole lot of things ensued there. But he did a great job with that publication. And when we first started out, like most of the world, analysts are analysts. Only here do we have two separate groups. Only here do we have this distinction, like, don't call me a crime analyst, I'm an intel analyst. So I think his publication went a long way towards maybe getting people to think across the aisle there, so to speak. And so he published that. Unfortunately, I had left the Police Foundation right before it got published. I'm not bitter about not being in the credits for that, Jason, but I kind of am a little bit.
Oh, I didn't realize you were, because I was part of that. You hooked me up with that, and I got an invite. And I remember walking into the room, I'm like, oh my, because there was a lot of big names in the industry at that point in time. It was very well put together. I probably knew that you weren't part of that, but I had totally forgot about you not being part of that. I'm sorry about that. And
no, it's okay. It's okay.
But
it was fine. I worked with some great people at the Police Foundation. Like I said, Greg and Karen Amendola, she was my boss there. But towards the end, it was obvious I needed to go somewhere else. And where the somewhere else I went worked out perfect for my career. So
yeah. And I will get to that in a second. But I have to tell the story that with that, when we were meeting, because we met for a couple of days with that group, putting together, exchanging ideas. And obviously it was, as I said, it was a great group, very diverse group. And I remember there was a lady there from the FBI, And we go around the room introducing ourselves and what we're expecting to get out of this. And she introduced herself, says she's from the FBI, and she's like, I'm just here to listen and to take information back to the agency. I'm like, of course you
Oh
are.
boy. I got kicked out of a SAC's office one time in DC, an FBI SAC. We go in there and we were trying to do a regional data sharing effort. And so
Mhm.
the ask was, hey, we'll share some of our data with you, but we want to see some of your data too. And it was basically like, no, we're not going to share any data. And I said, look, that's the problem. That's why you guys have this reputation, is because you're taking a lot of data from people. You're happy to do that, but we just want something back in return.
Yeah.
Something to where we feel like you're contributing. And that wasn't very well received. It was like, oh, I have another meeting to get to. You're going to have to leave.
That's not what I want to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So you go on to Alexandria PD, and so now this is the first time you're an analyst. You're at a police department. Obviously, you have studied, worked with the data, but I'm imagining that this was a little bit different the first time in your career being an analyst.
Jay, it was a big change because in the height, it was more, even though I was an analyst, it was more a grant funded position. And if I was a week late getting the report out, nobody cared, right?
Hmm.
In Alexandria, it's like rapid fire, right? We got
Yeah.
stuff happening every day. You're reading every report. We were just on the cusp of being an agency that was small enough to be able to read every report every day, but large enough where that was quite an endeavor, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
reading all the reports. We're using some cool software to do tactical crime analysis, Attack Workstation, Sean Bair software.
Hmm.
We're also using other tools and GIS and working for, at the time, Mary Guerin. Her name's Mary Craig now, a
Yep.
good friend of mine. We led the initiative to start Comstat at Alexandria. Well, we didn't. It was the chief who wanted to start Comstat, but then he relied on us to figure out how to do it along with one of the patrol captains.
Hmm.
And so we developed an online web browser where officers could view data on a map so they could prepare for the meeting. And
Not.
so it was just, there was a lot going on. But it was so much fun working there. And that's the thing, like when you can really sink your teeth into something, even if you're working 10 hours a day and you look up and you're like, oh, I was supposed to leave 2 hours ago. I mean, that's when that you're doing something you love, right?
Yes.
And that's the way it was there for me. There were times where I would go back into work at 7 o'clock at night and work for a couple hours because we had an active crime series. We had some wild stuff happen when I was there because if you think about it, where Alexandria is positioned, it's very close to Washington, D.C., yet
Hmm.
it's like this crazy mix of affluent and poor people all in one area. So, like, even in the movie, Remember the Titans, when Gary Bertier tells his mom, "I'm going to the Berg to play basketball with Julius." Well, the Berg was the housing project down in Old Town.
Hmm.
Okay, what they did is they wiped out half of the Berg and they built $800,000 townhomes. Well, back
Hmm.
then, that's the equivalent of like 1.5 million today, right?
Yeah.
So these super nice townhomes, and I'm not kidding you, Jason, attached to the back of them was public housing.
Yeah.
So you can imagine like the calls for service we would get for people saying, hey, there's guys hanging out on the street. And our dispatchers would be like, yeah, they've been hanging out on the street for 40 years there. I mean, right? What do you want to do? But it created this really interesting dynamic to where we would get complaints about public intoxication or people drinking open container violations. And so we go down there and one of the wealthy families is having a cookout and they're walking out in the street with a beer and they get arrested and they'd be like, no, we're talking about them, not us. But I mean, it was a really interesting thing. We also had these crime series that would break out, and almost every one of them was regional in nature. So it was very few that I remember that were confined to Alexandria because we were pretty small.
Hmm.
But we had Fairfax kind of wrapped around us and Arlington to our north, Prince George's County across the river. So almost every time we experienced a crime series, we would be able to communicate with our neighbors and find out, oh, yeah, more of it's happening throughout the region. And that's where it really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that when you're with one department, you're only getting one piece of the
Mm.
puzzle a lot of times. And how can you do analysis on a 20% of the data, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when tools like Lynx, which was really big at the time, it was just starting out, and we'd be able to look into Fairfax's RMS or other agencies around us. Like I remember we had a burglary series and a license plate, partial plate. I ran that partial plate in links and it came back to a traffic stop in Fairfax, connected to detectives. They closed out 6 burglaries. I mean, how cool was that?
Yeah.
And so when that started happening, it really opened my eyes like, hey, this data sharing thing is big. It's really big. So
You caught me with Remember the Titans because it's my memory works strangely, right? I forget certain details, but I'm gonna remember something. And you're like, I can't believe you remembered this. But wasn't it Remember the Titans where you saw it in the movie theater and then it was so good that you stayed for the second showing?
yes, I think I did that. Yes, that was a great movie.
Yeah,
Great
yeah.
movie. And I didn't realize, like, you hear about T.C. Williams and you hear about stuff, but like when you're in Alexandria, there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of history. And so once you kind of frame it into that context and you realize, hey, this T.C. Williams they're talking about is right here in Alexandria today. And that's kind of cool. And the high school that the African American students came from, that was now a middle school in Alexandria. And so that community had been dealing with a lot of stuff over the years. And so now, like one of the people that I worked with at Alexandria, Hassan Aiden, he was a captain at the time. I think he made deputy chief and then went to be a police chief in North Carolina. But he kind of built his career off being a school resource officer at TC Williams and interacting with those juveniles. And I would remember like how hard it was for him when one of them would get arrested because he worked with them through the years. So it was very tight community and a great place to work for the police department because just so many interesting things there that I was able to learn.
In terms of my timeline, you showed me something that for the first time when I visited you the one time, and you had a laptop and you had access to the data remotely. And that was the first time I had ever seen that happen, right? I was like,
Blew your mind, huh?
whoa. Yeah, like I was just like, you could do this, like the IT allows you to do this, or you got a laptop, and I was like, I mean, obviously now today that's old news, that's an old hat, and certainly as I work from home, I do that every day. But that first time when you showed me, here's our data, and here's our programs, here's our software.
Yeah, and Mary Craig, formerly Guerin, she was great, right?
Hmm.
So she realized when we started to the technology advanced to where we could take a laptop and do work, she'd request laptops so we could
Hmm.
do work at home or do work at a conference. And it wasn't like a work from home environment back then.
Hmm.
Like if you would have said, "Oh, I want to work from home," it was you're crazy.
Yeah.
But you could work from home at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night if there was a crime series going on and you were trying to stay abreast of something or you're working on something for the detectives, doing a link chart for a court case the next day, that type of thing. So,
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, this brings us to your other analyst badge story. It's 2008, and you are dealing with Victoria's Secrets and a retail theft issue.
yeah, so it was funny because David Baker was a police chief, great guy, and he comes to me and he's like, "Joe, I'm evaluated on part one crime, and how do we get these numbers down next year?" And I said, "Well, let me look at it, chief, and let me see where we have the most opportunity to succeed." And so I came back to him in a few days and I said, "You're not going to like my answer here." And
Mm.
he's like, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, part one crime back in the UCR days was dominated by larceny or theft. And so if we could find a way to impact larceny and theft, your numbers are going to look so much better. Even small decreases in that are going to carry more weight than like robberies because maybe we have a couple hundred robberies, but we have several thousand larcenies and thefts."
Mhm.
And I said, and then looking into those categories, I feel like there's one type of larceny or theft where we can make a huge impact. And he's like, "What's that?" And I said, "Shoplifting." And he like dropped his head, right? Because cops hate dealing with shoplifting. But I'm like, look, we have Landmark Mall, and at
Mhm.
Landmark Mall, we get called out there all the time for
Yep.
shoplifting.
Mhm.
And it's like we need to understand this problem better. And this was at the time of problem-oriented policing
Mhm.
and really trying to understand a problem. And the answers might not always be to arrest your way out of it. I said, so give me the freedom to work with one of the officers that we have and go out to Landmark Mall and try to understand everything about this problem and propose some potential solutions that if we can decrease crime out there, we can make an impact on Part 1 crime overall. And so he said, okay, do it.
Nice.
So we get out there, and one of the things we noticed right away is that every store had different policies for shoplifting. So Sears had this team of what I call like Rambo loss prevention people, that if somebody took one thing, they would rappel from the ceiling, tackle them, and call the police and lock them up, right? And then you had Lord and Taylor that had a policy that if you ever confronted the shoplifter and you were incorrect, you'd be fired on the spot. So nobody confronted shoplifters. And then Macy's had a policy that if you took one item, you were fine. They would let you go. But if you took two items, they would then try to detain you and call the police. So everybody had different policies. And so I took the data, I looked at the data across the whole mall, and I saw one that really jumped out to me. And it was Victoria's Secrets. And I looked at Victoria's Secrets and I said, wait a minute, we've had 7 incidents at Victoria's Secrets. And in those incidents, we've had like over $30,000 in loss. What the heck is going on here?
Wow.
And so we did basically we went to Victoria's Secrets and did a survey, like a site survey, to try to understand what was happening. And every policy they had was basically encouraging shoplifting. So the registers were in the back of the store. Their sensors didn't work. Their cameras didn't work. The most expensive merchandise was in the front of the store because they wanted that to sell quicker. They were short-staffed. They weren't consistent in their prosecution. And they, if you've ever been in the Victoria's Secrets, which you probably have, Jay, shopping for your wife, all of their inventory is on the floor. So they have this system where they have like dressers and then some stuff on top of the dressers. Well, those dressers, if you open that drawer, it has all their inventory for that particular item, right? So at the time you were talking $45 underwear, and then you open the drawer and there's 100 pair of $45 underwear.
Yeah.
So we're looking at this, and over this 6-month period, these, half a dozen or so events that we had, I'm talking with my cops officer and trying to figure out how we best address this problem. And this is a cops officer at Alexandria. It was like one that's supposed to think problem-oriented policing. And he's like, okay, Joe, here's what we'll do. I'll sit in the store across the hall and I'll wait for them to come and jump out and grab them. I was like, we've had 6 or 7 events in 6 months. Like, what, you going to sit out there every day? Like, that's crazy. I said, why don't we work?
Put on a watch list.
Why don't we work with the management and come up with some policies to change this? Point out to them how their policy, like, you could not see the front door from the cash register. And they were short-staffed. So if one person would go to buy something, then the front door is wide open. People could just take whatever they want and walk out. No sensors, no cameras working, all of that stuff. And so I said, what we need to do is we need to work with management there, and we need to get them on the right track in terms of protecting their own stuff. And so we did that. And I want to say, Jason, that in the next 2 things resulted from it. One, we ended up seeing over the next year a 70% decrease in theft from that store, and something ridiculous like a 40% decrease in the whole mall. And don't quote me on the numbers, it's been a long time. But also, we identified a crime series. Those half a dozen incidents were part of a crime series from Richmond all the way up to New Jersey, where they had, I'll loosely use the term gangs, but they were going into the store. They would be communicating on Bluetooth earpieces. And one would take an employee to the back to ask us to see something. And when they did, someone else would come in with a bag, and they would just shove all these expensive lingerie into the bag, and then they walk out. And we found cases down towards the Richmond area, other parts of Northern Virginia, all the way up through Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey. It was just their thing. They weren't getting caught. Why not? And I think there was like $2 million in loss through that corridor from Victoria's Secrets during that time period. So really interesting, right? And when you dig into it, and like a shopping mall, the fact that they all had different policies, and you got the feeling that the criminals knew the policies. It was kind of, but that was a really fun project, and I'm thankful that David Baker gave me the chance to work that.
Yeah, I can't imagine his reaction if you would have said specifically that you wanted to go work at Victoria's
Victories.
Secret.
Yeah. Oh, I caught a lot of heat for that over the years, you know?
I
Yeah.
bet you. I was like, you let Joe do what? And he's working with who?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Oh man. So no, that's good. That's a good story too when you can see that kind of impact and just looking at it from various angles and coming up with a procedure for change.
Well, one thing I always say is, if you look at problem-oriented policing, to me, that was the best strategy that we ever had when I was
Hmm.
an analyst. Maybe there's something better now, I don't know.
Yeah.
But when I was an analyst, that was the best strategy. And you had some really cool projects. You had the ceasefire thing in Boston. You had the Midnight Basketball League in Richmond. People had this correct understanding that the police can't solve all the problems,
Hmm.
right? We even had conversations where the police would sit down with social services and city officials. The problem is always in the policy of sharing data,
Hmm.
right? Where social services would never share data with the police, and police sometimes wouldn't share data with other people. And so that was the big challenge. And it became such a challenge, I think, that people kind of gave up on it. It's like, oh, this work is hard. Let's switch to something else.
Yeah.
and and that's a shame because I know that there was a lot of great projects that were done out there with problem oriented policing that reduced crime. And it was very collaborative effort. But unfortunately, we don't see that as much anymore.
Yeah. All right. Well, this takes us to Jacksonville Sheriff's Office then. So you leave the Commonwealth down to Florida and take a position there. And I think this is where now you start to getting into stuff that's more than just analysis, and you get into the management piece.
Yeah, I was right before I left Alexandria, probably a year before I left. Mary got promoted. She ran technology. I ran crime analysis. Our buddy Matt Smith came and worked with us.
Nice.
Carolyn Cassidy came and worked with us. We had a great team there in Alexandria. And I got a phone call that Matt White had left the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Matt actually called me and he said, "Hey, I left the Sheriff's Office. I built a great unit there. We got 20 analysts. We got Jamie Roush there. She's a great manager. And they're looking for somebody to replace me at that sheriff staff level. Could you come in and do that?" And I said, "No, I'm pretty happy here in Alexandria. I think this is like in July. I'm like, I got a great team here. We're doing great work. The department respects what we're doing and we're part of every decision. So I feel pretty good." So that conversation ends. And a few months later, actually, it was in November, I get a call back from Adam Brown, who was a chief in Jacksonville. And Chief Brown's like, "Hey, Joe, I keep hearing your name. We haven't been able to fill Matt's position. And I'd love for you to come down and consider this." And at the time, we had just had two huge snowstorms in Alexandria. And my wife and I were living in a condo, actually Mary Craig's condo, third floor condo, no elevator, walking up the steps and down the steps, all the
Oh
snow.
man.
And we said, you know what? Maybe it is a good time to move. So we moved down to Jacksonville, started working for the sheriff's office there. And I was on Sheriff John Rutherford's staff, who's now a congressman. And it was a great experience. It was a different experience because now you got to think differently. It's not just about like being a player coach. It was more about, well, now you're leading kind of the direction of the unit. Fortunately, she was great. She already had great systems in place, and Matt had created a lot of those. And so a lot of what I was doing was advocating for the analysts to get them better technology, better training, things like that. In fact, I remember one day, I just told this story recently, that I'm sitting in this meeting and I'm fighting for my folks, my 20 analysts, to get more of a training budget. We had like a $10,000 training budget for 20 analysts. And while I'm sitting in there, they put up the spreadsheet of what all the units at the sheriff's office got for training. And I'm like, "Hey, we need more than 10,000." And they're like, "Well, Joe, what do you want us to do? We only have a limited amount of budget." And I look up there and I'm like, "Look at the air unit. The air unit's got $120,000 allocated for training." And they're like, "Yeah, well, they have a very specific set of skills that they need to stay refreshed on, yada, yada." And I said, "Exactly. That's what my people have. Technology is changing all the time. And you want them working with knowledge base from 5 years ago. I need to get them out to trainings and things like that." Of course, that didn't go over very well. They're like,
Yeah.
really cool pilots and helicopters and crime analysts. Yeah, they didn't view it the same way. But that was my role, is fighting for them to get new technology and skills. And so after about 3 years in that role, I got promoted to run IT as well. And that was really eye-opening because we had our internal development resources there where we would build stuff for the sheriff's office. In fact, we built our own RMS years ago. Don't ever do that, by the way, to the listeners, because we had one guy that knew the code.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget the day internal walked into my office and said, I got to talk to you about that guy. And I'm like, not that guy. And they're like, that guy. And I'm like, oh no. So we had developers reading textbooks to try to figure out this code from 15 years ago. It was a nightmare, but it was an interesting time. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about technology. I learned a lot about interacting with the highest level of a large sheriff's office, 1,700 sworn, and how to really try to get things done where you have a lot of bureaucracy sometimes. Anytime an organization gets really large, you have a lot of bureaucracy. And so how do I figure out the right people to talk to get the right things? And so I think the thing I'm most proud of there, Matt, before I got there, had set up a career path for crime analysts, like crime analysts 1, 2, 3, supervisors. We didn't have that with IT. And so I set it up with IT so that I went into work one day, had an all hands meeting with IT and informed them that every single person in that room was getting a raise and that they were being placed on a career ladder so that they could continue to advance. And so that's the thing I think I'm most proud of my time there in Jacksonville.
Nice. And it's interesting too, as you think about the geography and size of Alexandria and then going to a county, a sheriff's office, and just the land area itself is tremendous. And you talked about the size of the department.
Yeah, it's the largest geographic city in the country. It's a consolidated city county, Duval and Jacksonville. And so I remember one time, like our analyst, Jamie, had set it up before I got there that when we had a major event, like any type of situation, missing person, whatever, and we'd have the command vehicle out, there was a spot for an analyst to go and sit on that vehicle and be a part of that, which I thought was really cool,
Nice.
Pretty innovative. Not many agencies were doing it back at the time. And so we had a manhunt on the west side of Jacksonville, and our office sat downtown. We're right downtown Jacksonville. Now imagine you're centrally located in the county or in the city, and you're going to drive out to the outskirts far southwest of the county and be a part of this operation. And so I remember driving out there, and it took me 45 to 50 minutes to get out. And that's from being centrally located. So if you go to the other side of the county line to county line, you're probably talking about an hour and a half at least.
Yeah.
And so it was a huge area, and we were divided into 6 patrol zones. We had we didn't call them captains. What do we call them? Assistant chiefs over each patrol zone. And then they were responsible for our ComStat, where they would report back something it was called crimes. We had the jail side had a ComStat too. It was called cons. Crimes and cons. But I'll never forget the first day that I went to the crimes meeting, and I walk into the meeting and the assistant chiefs all come in with binders that are like 5 inches thick.
Yep.
And I said to Jamie, I leaned over, I'm like, what is that? And she's like, they have every crime that happened in the last 2 weeks in that binder. And I'm like, why? And they're like, well, because the sheriff could ask about any of them at any time, and they got to be ready. And so Jamie and I talked about it, and we're like, we got to get those binders away from them. We got to figure out a way to do this on a computer or do this and make it easier. And so eventually, by the time we left, we had it so that the binders were much smaller. Still binders. They didn't want to give up the binders, but yeah. So.
Yeah, that is definitely during our lifetime, that whole idea of ComStat and the evolution of ComStat and how it went from these binders where you had to have so much information into the binders to data just being readily available every day. Right. I think it was Eric Pease. I got to ask Eric if he told me this. I always give him credit for this. So, but ComStat was created during a time when data wasn't readily available. So you would come to these meetings to learn about the data. And now you're not waiting after your morning coffee to get data nowadays. You're certainly not waiting to the meeting to make decisions.
Yeah, and then the accountability piece, which I think for Comstat when it originally came out in New York, right, that was the
Hmm.
thing. People would get fired on the spot
Mm.
if they didn't know their numbers or they didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
And I think the accountability piece is a big part of that. And depending on how an agency rolled it out, there were different levels to that. I don't think most of them didn't want to be New York. They didn't want to have that really strict
Yeah.
accountability. In order to get buy-in from people.
Hmm.
But even with that, you'd see different levels of accountability. Like in Jacksonville, they felt the need to have that really thick binder because the sheriff could ask them about that one, larceny case, and they had to
Yeah.
know about it. And in a way, that's kind of ridiculous, but I think the sheriff was just trying to keep them on their toes.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's true. All right. So I think it's interesting at this point because you make a decision and really change the trajectory of your career. You leave Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and you join Sean Bair at Bair Analytics, but it's not necessarily as an analyst.
No, no. In fact, so I had done some training for Sean. I always respected him. And it was always in the back of my mind, like if I were ever going to go to the private sector, I needed to be behind somebody. And it's still this way. I need to be behind somebody that I can buy into, that I can trust, right? Like
Hmm.
a CEO of a company, you have to believe in them, really. You're
Yeah.
trusting them. And so when I was at the sheriff's office, probably the most frustrating thing there is that the two-star chief that was over me, I had 7 of those in 4 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it was always a challenge, right? You'd have the 10 things you wanted to accomplish on your bulletin board. And by the time the year was over, you had 3 new chiefs and they had 3 new things. And so
Yeah.
you had one thing left, right? And I was just kind of tired of that a little bit.
Hmm.
I always said, generally speaking, in law enforcement, they would tell you to think outside the box until you did, and then they tell you to get back in the box. And so
That's a good one.
I was looking for something different where I could truly think outside the box. And I remember at the time my wife was thriving with the Pampered Chef. So
Mm.
she was a consultant. She would go out and host parties. And her and I were studying sales techniques, how to become a better salesperson, because that's what she did when she sold
Hmm.
Pamper Chef. And I remember as we're doing this, I said, I could probably be good at sales. I think I could do this. And so I decided one day I wanted to get into sales. And so my mentor in sales is a guy named Chris Turnus at LexisNexis. And he was my account manager at Jacksonville.
Yeah.
And so I reached out to Rick Graham, who used to work at Jacksonville, but was with LexisNexis. And Chris, he said, call Chris. And so I text him. I'm like, hey, Chris, could I call you? It's personal. And he's like, yeah, call me tonight. So he talked to me for an hour one night while I was with the sheriff's office, giving me the pros and cons of sales, the pros and cons of a big company like LexisNexis versus a smaller company like a Bair Analytics. And I remember from that conversation thinking, I'm doing this. I'm doing
Yeah.
it. And so after hanging up with Chris, I reach out to Sean Bair. I know I want to do sales, but he doesn't know I want to do sales. So I reach
Yeah.
out to Sean and I say, hey, here's what I want to do. And I want to come work for you. I think we could do some awesome stuff. Sean says, man, this sounds amazing. What do you make now? He's just trying to get a gauge for like where I was. And I told him, and he says, the only thing I could do for you, you'd have to be in sales. That's the only way I could pay you what you're making now. And I said, well, you're going to have to pay me a lot then, even though I wanted to do sales. So he didn't pay me a lot. He's a very shrewd negotiator. But
Hmm.
what he did, which was really clever, is I had a newborn. She was like 6 weeks old, I think. And at the time, he's like, hey, I tell you what, you and your wife fly out here, see the office in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, talk to me. Your wife can be in the meeting. We'll talk about kind of the vision of the company, where we're going, all this stuff. Meet my wife, Dana. It'd be great. So we flew out to Colorado with my daughter, Julia, who was like 6 weeks old, my wife, and me. And Colorado is a magical place. Yeah, you've been out there with me, Jason.
Yes.
Like seeing the mountains and the air smells so fresh. And I mean, it's just beautiful. And we got out there and we're sitting in the conference room, and I didn't care what Sean said, I was coming, you know.
Yeah.
But we had a good meeting. Sean negotiated really hard, but he got me, and we ended up moving the family out to Highlands Ranch, Colorado. And at that point in my career, I was really looking for more freedom and more flexibility to kind of figure things out on my own, right? I knew in sales I had a lot to learn, but I knew that I could do it and pick up a new valuable skill set. So you and I picked you up in Nashville, right? Near
Yes,
Nashville.
yes, yes. It was
And
Nashville at the
you
time.
helped me drive across the country. My
Yep,
wife stayed back with the kids, and we almost ran out of gas in Kansas. I remember
yep.
that vividly.
I
We were
was a
scared to
bad,
death.
yeah, I was a bad passenger. I was a bad passenger, not reading the map correctly.
And we got to Colorado. I lived in a hotel for like 3 weeks. You stayed that weekend, I think, and then flew
Yes.
back.
Hmm.
And then my family came out to join me. And here's the thing that a lot of people ask about going to the private sector, because they say, hey, I'm in a government job and it's really secure. And yeah, it is. And I was more secure in any given government job than I am today,
Hmm.
right? But as an overall, like the skill set that you have and your marketability, when you can learn something completely new, like sales, as an example, or business, any type of business. Well, now maybe you're not as secure in that one given job, but you're more secure overall, if that makes sense.
You're more
So
marketable.
now I have the skill set of being an analyst, and I can still go back and do that. I have to refresh up on some of the tech,
Hmm.
obviously, but I can do that. I could go back and be an analyst. But I could also, if for some reason I lost my job today, I could go do sales somewhere else, right? Because I've now learned how to sell. And so that's what I would encourage people to kind of think about, especially those analysts that may be considering going to the private sector, but they're worried about, well, I have the security of this job. And if I go to Penlink or,
Hmm.
Palantir, name the company, I'll have less security. Yes, you will in that one job, right? Because markets can change, they can downsize, whatever, but you will be learning valuable things that you can take to that next opportunity. So just encourage people to think that way.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting as well how the private sector, especially with law enforcement, has morphed over the years. Because you talked about the idea of not having security with the position, but it normally meant that you were traveling all the time or you were in sales. But now the private sector has really embraced the remote work from home idea, and a lot of police departments have not. They're like, I want them back in the office. So now you're talking about an idea of possibly more money and working from home that makes the private sector all that more appealing.
Yeah, I mean, there's perks. And the coolest thing, I probably couldn't go out and sell knives today, right? I have to be passionate about what I'm selling. And so at when I was with LexisNexis, which we'll probably get to, but I was pretty passionate about the tool that we had because it went back to that data sharing thing that we talked about when I was with Alexandria. And so, like, to me, that's still a big problem law enforcement needs to solve. So I was very passionate about that. And I'm very passionate about what I'm doing now, which also goes back to the data sharing component. So I feel like there's enough parallel between what I did as an analyst, who I meet with now, and what my goals are now. And it's very aligned with what my goals were when I was an analyst. So I feel like for those folks that are out there, maybe thinking about a career transition, there's a lot of opportunity out there. Companies are always looking for people with expertise and people who know how police departments function. And I would argue that a crime analyst, a good crime analyst, knows how their department functions as well as anyone else in the department. And if you don't, get curious and learn how your department functions. I'm serious
Yeah,
because,
get
like,
curious. Good,
if
good
you
advice.
learn if you learn how all these processes work behind the scenes at your department, like what happens when an incident report's written all the way to an arrest is made, or what happens when somebody fills out a bike registration, or
Hmm.
what happens when somebody goes to your police academy, all of these things, if you're curious about them, it makes you more marketable within your department. And then eventually when you leave your department, there's so many people I talk to, and this is my pet peeve, and not just because I'm in sales and I get ignored a lot, but I talk to people, and the thing that kills me, Jay, is when I talk to an analyst and they're like, yeah, I've been here for 7 years. I got 7 more years to go before pension or
Hmm.
whatever it is. They don't listen to me. They don't buy me anything, and they're hopeless. And I'm
Yeah,
like, don't be hopeless. If
yeah.
you're hopeless, find something new. The people who are like, well, I'll look at your demo, but I have no power to buy anything. You know what? That makes me sad. Find that person that in your agency that's a mover and a shaker, the people that can get things done in your department. Network with them, become tight with them and friendly with them, and then let them help you push the things that you need through your department. It's very important. Don't sit there and be miserable as an analyst when you could find these connections and make things happen. I've seen great analysts out there who have literally been the one analyst at their department, and they've convinced their department they need a whole unit for them to run with a bunch of people in it.
Yeah.
It's happening all over the country with real-time crime centers and places like this. Matt White did it in Jacksonville, where he went from having like a couple random analysts in the department to building a unit of 20 people with 3 supervisors.
Yeah.
You gotta think about it a little differently. So that's my inspirational message.
Yeah, there is something to be said about being comfortable with and being miserable, right? It's just,
Yeah.
I don't know. There's obviously fear and it's comfort zone, and you certainly have all else outside the realm of your profession, your personal life, or where you're at. It is heartbreaking to hear when someone says that, like, I'm not listened to, or I don't get buy-in, or I just don't feel like I'm adequately being used.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I go out there and I talk to these analysts, I try to leave them with a message like that. I presented at IACA this year,
Mm-hmm.
and we paid for that presentation as a private company. And so what I did is, it's supposed to be an hour. I did not want to hit somebody with an hour-long sales pitch at a professional conference.
Sure.
And so I got an analyst to help me from Washington State. And I said, do me a favor, pitch your, Emily Dorsher was her name. She's from Marysville. I said, like, give them the best practices for creating a bulletin for the first half hour. And then I'll come in and show them our tool for the last like 25 minutes. And then for the last 5 minutes, I try to leave them with like something motivational for when they go back to their department that they could use, and walk out of there with their shoulders back and their chest out, like, hey, I am a crime analyst, hear me roar. Right? Yeah. Because I'm telling you, there's nobody, if you really dig in to your data and your processes, there's nobody in that department that's going to be more of an expert on everything than you. There'll be somebody who'll know this more than you or that more than you, but nobody will be as well-rounded as an analyst because you can see all of the data. So I don't know. Okay.
No, that's good. And so you just described the polished version of you as a salesperson, but I am curious, okay, you're going back to starting at Bair Analytics, and this is something you wanted to do. This is something you studied. So let's just take us back to maybe that, either that first sales pitch or those first couple weeks there, and just how you felt and what you were thinking and how it turned out.
I thought I was a good salesman right from the start. Looking back, I was terrible. I say to myself, I sold 600,000 in software in my first year at Bair. And I say that all that software that I sold was going to sell itself anyway, right? I didn't do anything special because I really didn't know how to sell. But one thing I knew is I read a book right when I got started, and it talked about, like, have you ever been out maybe shopping for a suit or clothes, and you go into the place and the person helping you is just so nice, not pushy, asking you questions about, like, what do you prefer? Do you like certain colors? Just being friendly with you. You intended to spend $100 in there, and you spent $500 and you walked out and you had the best experience ever. You felt great about it. Well, that's a great salesperson, right? So I took that to heart, and I'm like, look, my job is not to push something on people. I'm not that guy that calls you every week and says, hey, what about now? Hey, what about now? I am the person that talks to you, understands what your needs are, explains what we have to offer, and figure out if there's synergy. Can our solution meet your needs? If so, is there a path to get it to you? And if you tell me there is, I will work with you along that path. If you tell me there's not, I will reach back out at a later date when there might be a path. It took a long while to learn that, Jay. So right in the beginning, you default to what you experience on the other side of it, right? Which is, oh, somebody calls me 100 times in a month. That's what I need to do, you know? And so thankfully, I was able to learn that is not the way to do sales. And I think a lot of the people that have worked with me over the years, that's one thing I love, is that I'm selling to some of the same people that I networked with when I was an analyst, right? And I think some of them will tell you, most of them will probably tell you that working with me has been a pretty good experience, right? There's probably a few that'll say, yeah, I hate that guy. But for the most part, my job is not to push. My job is not to get you to do something you don't want to do. My job is to help you see that there's a solution to a problem that you have, and how do I take you to getting that solution? And so I put a lot of stock in building those relationships in that fashion, right? I don't want anybody to ever feel like they were sold. I want them to feel like they were helped.
Yeah. I remember you gave me a really good tip, and it might have been around this time, and we got to talking about sales because I've preached on this show for a long time about analysts as sales folks and the importance of being sales. And you were the one that really have turned my attention to this idea. And I remember the one tip that you gave me is that somebody would ask, does the software do this? And your answer wasn't necessarily yes or no. Your answer was more inquisitive, trying to understand what question are they trying to answer, and to then be able to guide them. Again, you're trying to get an understanding from them on like where their needs are and how to help them.
Well, Jay, if your solution can share data with other jurisdictions or not, right? You can limit it to just their jurisdiction. And they ask the question, does your solution share data with other jurisdictions? And you say, yes. Well, they say, well, we don't want it to do that. Well, now you're backpedaling, right?
Yeah.
And you're fighting this battle. So that's just a technique. Does your solution allow us to share data with other jurisdictions? Is that of interest to you? Would you like to share with other jurisdictions? Well, yes, with most of our data, but there's some we want to lock down to just us. Great. Our solution allows for that.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have to take a little more time to understand the nature of the question. As a human, we get a lot of pride in somebody asking a question, us knowing the answer and wanting to answer quick. Right.
Yeah.
There's actually a book I read about connecting with people, and it talks about, like, have you ever been in one of those conversations where someone is sharing some experience? Like maybe you play chess, right? Maybe you play chess at a really high level, and they're talking about, yeah, well, last weekend I went to this chess tournament. I did really well, blah, blah, blah. They say at that point, you're not supposed to reply and say, I play chess too. They say it is so much more attractive and will be such a better connection for you to respond to them about their chess experience, talk about some other things, and then at a later point in the conversation, bring up, when you're talking about chess, I happen to play chess too. Yeah. Because what that does is it shows the person who's talking about chess that you care about listening to them more than you care about one-upping them. Like,
yes.
And so I think in sales, it's really important because I do care about listening to them. And I've even talked to people who outrank me and said, hey, we don't need to have all the answers. Yeah. Sometimes it's okay if they ask a question that we don't have to, boom, hit them back with an answer, or boom, just let them talk. Let's hear more of what they have to say. And that's what I found has been really helpful.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. And again, I could definitely talk to you about sales for a long time, but
Jay, let me add this one thing, because I think what I told you was somewhat true back in the day when we talked about this, that analysts are good at sales because if you're a good analyst, you've had to sell a lot of concepts within your department. But what I learned when I started doing sales is that that's not sales. That's persuasion, right? Yeah. Persuasion is a part of sales. But one thing I'll tell you, like, if you are one of those analysts that's thinking about getting into sales, like I've had a lot of people approach me and say, hey, would you hire me to do sales? And if I'm looking for entry level, I would hire a crime analyst to come right in and do sales. But if I'm looking for a senior rep, I would not hire a crime analyst to come in and do sales normally. It would have to be an extraordinary circumstance. And the reason why is because sales is not getting somebody to say yes. In government sales, it's everything that happens after that. Where do we go from here? How do we get through your CJIS process? How do we get through your privacy restrictions? How do we go through city council? What is your fiscal year? When are you going to have money? All of that minutia that you got to deal with. So I don't want to misrepresent sales to the analysts out there if they were thinking about that.
Mhm.
The fun part is going in the room and convincing command staff to do something or persuading them and finding a solution for them and then being like, yeah, I love this. And then
Mhm.
you wait 18 months for your deal to happen.
Yeah.
The part about that is getting the deal done and figuring that out. And that's what you need to become an expert in. That's the new stuff you need to learn. You're going to come in and be able to persuade people because you've been doing that as an analyst. But the
Mhm.
part where you have to grow coming into a sales role is everything that happens after that and the knowledge and the skills to work your way through. I have an opportunity right now that I'm working, and they were like, hey, we don't have money. We're broke. Looked into
Mhm.
all the grant money, looked into the COVID money. We don't have anything.
Yeah.
And so in a passing thought, walking out of the room, I was like, wait a minute. What about seized assets? Have you thought about that? Maybe we could do seized assets. Let me make a phone call. Hey, I think we could fund this for 2 years out of seized assets. So little things that you learn along the way that can help actually get a deal done. That's really important. And so that would be a growing process for an analyst making the transition to a sales role.
Yeah, and I do think it's an important point because it's funny. I just watched Trains, Planes, and Automobiles for the first time in probably 30 years, and of course, John Candy's role is he sells shower curtain rings, right? And so for him, it's the one sale, it's getting that yes, exchanging, you have the transaction, and then you're off, right? You'd
Yeah.
never hear probably from that person again, and that's kind of like this classic salesperson going door to door. But your point is really valid in that with this type of sale, when you're selling software, that's just the beginning. The initial pitch and the initial agreement is just the beginning of the journey, right? You talked about 18 months. I mean, it even goes beyond that when you're talking about once it's implemented and then the service after that as their issues. So it's really establishing a lifelong relationship.
It really is, Jay. And there's a lot of reward on my side for that because I had a 5 year sales cycle with my last company with a department in Texas. Just because of sieges and some other things, they wanted to like dot their I's and cross their T's. But through the course of that 5 years of working with people there, I mean, I developed friendships, like true
Mhm.
friendships, because you're going through this with them. You guys both have a common goal to get this thing done and it's hard suffering. It's
Yeah.
like we're almost there. Me and my boss high five in the parking lot in 2018. Yeah, they're buying it. Yeah, it's great. And then we don't get the deal done until 2023. It's
Wow.
long suffering, hard suffering,
Yeah.
But you build those relationships and you make those contacts. And the coolest part is when I started doing sales in 2014, some of the people I worked with were sergeants and lieutenants are now police chiefs. How
Yeah.
cool is that? You get to kind of watch them progress. And even though I've already sold them stuff and I don't have anything to sell them, when they get promoted to deputy chief or chief, you get to reach out without any pretext, without any like, hey, I want you to buy something. So congrats on this promotion. But no, it's truly in your heart. You're thankful and grateful you had the chance to work with them. And now they're a chief of police. And you knew they were going places because
Yeah.
they were visionary back then. So
Yeah.
it's cool.
Yep. Very cool. All right. So you're at Bair. LexisNexis buys out Bair. And so you go from Bair being a fairly small company to this juggernaut that is LexisNexis. So I am curious as you look back at it now and you're reevaluating that time of going, just as an employee, going from Bair to LexisNexis.
Yeah. So first of all, big shout out to Sean Bair. Yes, he sells the company a year after I moved my family across the country, but he wasn't just concerned about like taking the high dollar. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure he had a lot of offers. And
Mhm.
he was very concerned about his employees, how they would be taken care of, and really selling to the right place. And I think he made a great choice. Lexus kept every employee. There were a few that jumped ship just because they were
Mhm.
worried about what would happen or maybe had
Sure.
another opportunity. But when you hear about acquisitions, you kind of think about things that you've heard, like, oh, this company acquires this company and fired everybody.
Yeah.
Well, no, Lexus was really, I mean, the way they handled that was with pure class.
Nice.
They reassured everybody. Most of us got pay raises and maybe all of us. And then it was like trying to figure out what your new role was going to be at this company. So
Yeah.
when I talked about selling at Bair Analytics, people would ask me my territory and I'd say Earth. And if we colonize Mars, it'll be that too. Like I
Yeah.
was it. I was the guy. Sean Bair was my backup. And it's
Yeah.
like we'd go out and sell stuff.
Uh-huh.
And so when I go to Lexis, they now have 6 sales territories. They have several people, inside sales, outside sales. And it's like, whoa, where do I fit in?
Mhm.
And the great part about it is they didn't know a whole lot at the time about crime analysis. So they had sold to investigators mostly. The Accurate platform was searching public records. And so most of their contacts were in the investigative realm. And now they have this crime dashboard that was called Attack Raids that will allow you to do crime analytics. And so they needed someone to basically liaise with all of the reps and go out to the various departments and show them the value of a crime dashboard. So from Lexis, it's hard to get in with a Atlanta PD or an NYPD or a Dallas PD. I'm sorry, at Bair, it was hard to get in with those big agencies. But at Lexis now, they already had the contacts and investigations in those departments. And so now it's like, oh, well, let's bring Joe in and now we'll talk to the analysis unit. And so maybe we can get this product in this bigger PD and kind of grow from there. And so for several years, that was kind of my role at Lexis, is to work with the sales staff. And it was great, Jay, because I
Mhm.
learned like what professional sales was,
Yeah.
both good and bad, right? I worked with reps that were really good and I worked with reps that were really bad. And I kind of learned what to do and what not to do. One of the hardest things I think in sales is like asking hard questions. And there was one rep in particular who I didn't think was a great rep, but she was great at that, right? She would
Yeah.
ask the hard question, like, "What is your budget for this project?" And just let it linger. And I'm like, I'm getting tingles. Like, what is say something? But she would just throw it out there, like really hard questions, and wait. But it allows you to see, like, hey, sometimes she's successful, and they answer that question, and now it's no longer a mystery. Like you can move forward. And so I learned so much over those 3 years. And so I mentioned Chris Turnus. He was my rep when I was with Jacksonville. And then he ends up becoming my director. And Scott Jackman, who was my senior director, both of them I consider as mentors, learned a lot from them in my time at Lexis. And we were selling a product called Accurate Virtual Crime Center that allowed you to connect agencies' RMS and search through public record and RMS data together. And I thought that that had a lot of value. I still do. I still talk about it, right? I was at a conference and the Lexis rep went before me, and then I went and I said I could have given his presentation too, because like there's a lot of value in that. And just the nature of policing in the United States with 18,000 departments across the country,
Yeah.
we need to do a better job of talking, right?
Hmm.
And so that solution helps with that. And so I was locked in on that mission of providing that solution across the country. In fact, I had 4 states in the Southwest once I got a territory, and I loved going out there and talking about it. The one thing, though, that I always said when I was an analyst is that the piece that's missing is the informal data that gets shared amongst departments through email all the time, right? So whether it's sending an email to the neighboring jurisdiction, hey, do you know Jason Elder, white male, goatee, brown hair? Or the form of an actual product, a bulletin, a wanted poster, officer safety, whatever it is, that information still to this day is being shared through email, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. It's created a situation of information overload, and it's also created an insecure way of sharing data. Even if your data is encrypted and stuff like that, it's still not the best way to share the data. And then if it's not encrypted, like who's hitting the forward button on that? And where's it getting forwarded to? Right. So there's all these implications around the sharing of data that really came to light when I was at LexisNexis. And I was like, hey, we could do a lot better job of sharing our MES data, but then also sharing all this other data that's kind of sitting out there. So,
Yeah. It's interesting how you found your niche and you went in with a lot of unknowns. You went in with that transition of like, where's my role? And how you and the others establish the role and find a need, fill a need, and how that with LexisNexis was really made the transition all that much better, and you could thrive, right? There was a role for you there. You all grew together in a way. It's
Yeah.
maybe even kind of hard to imagine LexisNexis being the juggernaut that it is was also had room to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of success there. I think I made their circle of excellence 4 out of the last 5 years there. So
Hmm.
I was getting pretty good at selling the Accurate Virtual Crime Center solution and some of the other things that they've come out with. I was missing the startup environment a little bit
Mm-hmm.
because the way I describe it, and even the folks at Lexis will tell you this, and it's not just Lexus, it's big companies, right? You have a small company, it's like a speedboat. You make your quick turns, and so something's going to change, we'll make a quick turn. You're at Lexus, it's like a cruise ship. It
Yeah.
takes a while to move a different direction just because it's big and there's a lot of process and you really want to think through things. And I get it. That's why they've been successful for a long time. They don't make sharp turns. They go gradual and they figure out what's going to work for all their customer base. But in a way, when I'm out there talking to an analyst and they're like, "Hey, I'd like a button to do this." And that just totally makes sense to me. And I'm like, "Oh yeah, that would be great. Every agency could use that. Why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah.
I want that button as
Yeah.
much as they want that button, but I want it in a few weeks." And so that's what you get in that startup environment that I had at Bair. I mean,
Yeah, I was.
Sean Bair whiteboarding on his glass window, writing all kinds of stuff on there. Like, it's crazy. We could have a demo on a Friday and they could be like, "Yeah, it should do this." And Sean would be like, "Let's meet next Wednesday." And by Wednesday, it's in the
In
product.
fact, yeah, I was just thinking, I was definitely thinking that exact same thing. That was back to the way Sean would have it and be able to implement it. So, and then your idea here of this lost communication, this idea of emails and everything else, was that something that eventually got implemented there at LexisNexis?
So their focus is on the sharing of RMS data. They've also started integrating with a lot of partners. I don't really want to speak for them.
Mm-hmm.
They have good marketing. You'll find out about it. But I had told them a while ago, like, you're missing this informal layer of data, the bulletins that are
Mm-hmm.
flying around everywhere on email. And it was something that they recognized but just didn't prioritize, which is okay, right? They got to
Yeah.
make the best decisions and decisions that are going to make them money. But I don't have anything bad to say about the company. I mean, it was a
Yeah.
great place to work, great people. The people really care about law enforcement. And one thing I'll tell you, in the last several years there, they've really upped their game in terms of bringing people with great law enforcement experience into business positions, which I think is great
Yeah.
because it offers that career path for people. They got a guy in market planning now, which is their strategy unit, named Dan Morrissey, who was over technology at Sacramento County Sheriff. I mean, Dan's
Mm-hmm.
brilliant. Josh Levin was a former crime analyst. He's in market planning. You got people who are their head of marketing used to be a crime analyst in North Carolina. They have people that are going into these roles now that get the customer, which is really important.
Yeah.
So I think that they're going to start doing some big things around that.
Yeah. Because where you are now with the multitude insights, you're getting into this idea of data information being emailed, and I can totally relate to that idea. There are times when in my team I sometimes email, I sometimes I sometimes it's part of a channel on Teams, sometimes I'm calling them on the phone, sometimes it's written on my piece of paper in front of me. I mean,
Smoke
that's but
signals, carrier pigeon.
yeah, it's like 5 times, and then it's 3 months later, and the question comes up, and I'm like, oh, where is that information stored? It can be a time trying to backtrack and find where that discussion was held.
This scenario that we have with email right now, Jason, is nobody's fault. In fact, a lot of people have done some great things with it. We're just out there meeting last week with departments who maintain listservs where they're
Mhm.
sharing information all throughout their region via an email listserv. So me as an analyst at one department can just type an email to the listserv and then boom, it shoots it out to all 800 members on their listserv. That came from a good place. It came from a place of, we need to share this information better.
Mhm.
Okay. But it's using a mechanism that is antiquated. You
Mhm.
have 30 or 40 apps on your phone that you used to do via email, but
Yeah.
they realized, hey, email's not a good place for that. Right. I have 2 kids in club soccer. If I'm getting emails about their game changes or there's practice change, I'm going to be late to everything. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have an app called Team Snap on my phone. And if their thing changes, I get a notification. Hey, practice is at 6 tonight, not 7. Right. So they're now with the technology that's available, not just through apps and new websites and things like that, but through artificial intelligence. You're talking about massive amounts of data that are being exchanged through email. And we have tools that can present the right information to the right people at the right time. That's the message. That's the thing that got me jazzed and excited to go to Multitude Insights. A lot of people don't know this, but I had hit the what they call Circle of Excellence at Lexis again. We had a trip planned to Italy in April of last year. That comes with a sizable monetary bonus. All of that. And I get a phone call from the other Matt White,
Yeah.
who was the CEO of Multitude Insights, which I thought was really ironic.
Yeah.
I've now went to 2 places because of Matt White's.
Yeah.
But he's like, hey, Joe, I need you to come lead the sales team in January. And I'm like, can this wait till May? Because I got a bonus coming, a trip to Italy. And he's like, no, I need you now. We need to do big things. That's how strong this message is. That's how important it is for me. And I know that we can help solve this problem of all of these bulletins right now that are going into a big black hole. Okay. And I know it because I was an analyst who tried to read everything, yet I still had a folder set up that said bulletins and a forwarding rule where they would go into that folder and at most times would have 100 unread emails in there. And when I had that pocket of time in my day, I'd go through and skim them real quick. But I wasn't giving them the due diligence that I should have. And I bet you there were cases that could have been solved that were stuck in that inbox folder, right? And so that's the idea. Like what we're doing with Multitude Insights, we have a solution called Bulletin, BLTN. And the idea is it's now a platform, a website where you can go, you can create bulletins or upload bulletins right onto that site, onto that platform. And when you do, you now have the ability to search those bulletins. I tell people if it just did that, that would be so much better than what's out there now. Because when I talk to people who are still doing bulletins through email, searching is the biggest problem. Even ones that take and store their bulletins on SharePoint, let's face it, searching on SharePoint sucks. Everybody knows it. Okay. Searching through email sucks worse. Okay. But even if it was just a platform where all your bulletins resided and you could search them, that would be incredibly valuable. But what we're able to do now is apply an AI layer to that so that when you upload a bulletin, it will go out and search for similar bulletins and put those together as a collection of similar bulletins. And so now you can say, hey, these may be related. It jumpstarts that ability to identify crime series and patterns. Okay. It's truly game changing. I look at it as like saving an analyst so much time. I describe it as if I took your best analyst at whatever department, stuck them in a room, handed them a stack of 100 bulletins, told them nobody was going to bother them for 4 hours. Here's a highlighter. Here's some Post-it notes. Find the pattern in there. Everyone would find it. Okay, so it's not inventing data. It's not like rocket science or anything. It's just finding that pattern within seconds rather than hours, or maybe more likely not finding it at all, because what analyst has 4 hours of uninterrupted time? And so when I was pitched this by Matt, I was like, this is exactly what I've been asking for the last 7 years, like, or even back to my time as an analyst. And the world needs to know about this. Like, we need to do that. And so much of our efforts at Multitude is really about getting out there and letting people see it. So that's why it drives me crazy when I go to give somebody a demo and they're like, we don't have any money. I don't want to see it. I just want you to see it. I just want you to see it. Because if you see it, when you do have money, you'll call me back. Right? Yeah. I want people to see it and be exposed to it, to know what's available to you when the time is right to get something like this, because it'll definitely help you. I got to tell you, Jay, out of probably 150 meetings I've had this year, there's been like 2 meetings where I was told, I don't like it too much. 148 of those meetings ended with like very positive, like, yeah, this is needed. Now, did I make 148 sales? No, I did not, because of everything we talked about before. Right. Yeah. But the interest is there. People are excited about it. They know this is needed. It's just a matter of getting that momentum to where it becomes a foregone conclusion that the whole state is going to do this type of thing. So
yeah,
pretty fun. I'm passionate.
Yes, obviously you're excited about it, which is great to see. So, all right,
Yeah.
well, we'll put links in the show notes and a contact information for Joe for those that are listening to this and have any questions for him or want to know more about his journey and all the stops along the way. All right, Joe, we're running a little bit long here, so I do want to move on. We got a couple more segments here, and so we are going to do the call-in segment now, Ask Joe, as I talked about in the beginning. So we got callers on the line, and they're asking you, Joe, any number of questions. I left it wide open. I said you can ask questions about law enforcement analysis. You can ask people about personal, any kind of advice. It's a wide range of questions that you're going to be able to answer here. But I always tell people that Joe is an open book. And he's obviously quite thoughtful. And so even is information that he might not know very much about, he always seems to find an interesting answer for it. First on the line is Sean. Sean, what's your question for Joe?
Joe Ryan, analyst extraordinaire. I would like to ask if you could compare and contrast the differences between working for startups, big corporations, and in government as an analyst. And let me know your thoughts on preference and pros and cons and all the scoop.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit. I think for me, I love the startup environment. It's
Mhm.
fun. I mean, you never know. I compare it to when I was a crime analyst in Alexandria and stuff was happening really quickly, right? You
Mhm.
come to work one day. This is the beauty of being a crime analyst too, is like you come to work and you don't know what's going to be on your plate that day. I used to say I'd have 20 things on my to-do list and I get 20 things done that day, but nothing from my to-do list because a bunch of new stuff came up, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And so it's kind of that way in the startup world too. Things happen fast. You have one customer meeting and somebody tells you, hey, it would be great if your solution did this. And then you talk to the CEO and you talk to the CTO and you're like, this is what the customer told me. And they're like, wow, that's a great idea. Hey, okay, we'll add that to the roadmap. We'll start working on that. So that's the flexibility that you get in that startup environment. On the business side of it, though, there's advantages to being in corporate too,
Mhm.
right? So from an employee standpoint, there's a lot of resources for you at a place like LexisNexis. Like
Mhm.
you need a marketing slick or a flyer, there's a library where you go get it.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the startup world, you need a flyer, you're making it on Canva, you know?
Yeah.
So they're just so different and each has their own pros and cons. If you said today, Joe, you could start a new job like tomorrow, would it be startup, corporate, or would it be a crime analyst again and start your career fresh? I wouldn't do it any different. Honestly, I would start as an analyst because I feel like you get a lot of knowledge of how a police department works. We talked about that before. Then I would go to a startup because if you believe in the CEO, you believe in the mission, you get to learn business under that person and you get to apply your skills from being in the public sector. And then you could migrate to a corporate position as well. And from there, now I took it one step further and came back to a startup. So, but there's advantages to all. That's a good question, Sean.
All right. Next on the line is another Sean. Sean, what's your question for Joe?
Yes, I was curious if you could tell me what do you think caused violent crime to drop in the 1980s? Thank you very much.
Who was that?
Violent. That was Sean, the
Just random
caller. I
Sean?
mean, this is kind of sounding like I don't know, English or James Bond or something.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, Sean's asking about the crime drop in the 80s.
Well, I mean, obviously technology is always improving, right?
Yeah.
And so there was new technology that came in the 80s that helped. But there was also new strategies and different ways of dealing with problems. I'm not exactly sure the timing of like the zero tolerance policing in New York, but I do know that there was a cleanup effort. Places like Times Square, that was a big problem. When you think of those major cities and implementing a new strategy that's maybe tougher policing, that's when those things started coming in. I'm not sure. I mean, look, I like a safe city as much as the
Mhm.
next person. I'm not sure about strategies like zero tolerance. I look at like the racial component of it. I'm a white male. I've never been stopped and field interviewed, never one time in my life from walking down the street. And I have friends that are of a different race and they've experienced that. And should they have experienced that? I don't think so. One thing I've always said about policing is, like, when you look at the different strategies that we had to combat crime, it always seemed to fall back to saturation. Oh, there's crime in this neighborhood. Let's saturate, let's saturate,
Yep.
let's saturate. And to me, I think there could be more thoughtful strategies like evidence-based or intelligence-led or problem-oriented policing, right? Where not everything is squashing the problem with an iron fist, which tends to have an impact on the good, innocent people in a community that aren't criminals, but maybe don't look like you or I, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And so there's a lot of things there. I know I went pretty broad on that answer, but it's kind of a general question
Yep.
from a very strange voice.
All right. Next on the line is Mary. Mary, what's your question for Joe?
Hey, Joe, Mary Craig, going back in the Wayback Machine. Hey, what was the name of that rooftop burglar in Alexandria?
Oh, gosh, I don't remember that name. I don't remember that guy's name, but I tell you what, Mary and I worked some really interesting crime series, and that guy was breaking into restaurants through the roof, right? And it was happening in Alexandria and also other places. And we did a ton of like next event predictions using Attack Workstation and things like that. We also had a guy doing residential burglaries, and we could not figure out how this guy would always hit when the people were out of town. We're like, are the people vacationing at the same spot and the guy has an inside track there or whatever? Well, in a couple of the incident reports, we noticed that he was putting a newspaper on the front door handle of the home. And so what he would do is he would take this newspaper and hang it from the front door handle. And if in 3 days he came back and it was still on the front door handle, he assumed they were on vacation. He'd break into the house. So there are all these interesting things. We had this one crime series where Dodge Caravans are being stolen, and every time they get recovered, the back seat's missing. And we're like, what is going on here? Well, we were able to correlate that with motorcycle thefts. They were stealing Dodge Caravans, throwing the back seat out, stuffing motorcycles in the back, and taking off with them. It took us a while to figure that one out. So, Mary, thanks for the question. We worked a lot of cool stuff. I don't remember names, though. Are you kidding? I'm over 50.
All right. Then coming up is Matt. Matt, what's your question for Joe?
Hey, Joe, this is Matt. So what do you miss the least about working in a law enforcement agency now that you've been gone so long?
I have to say that I didn't like it. I loved it when people would say, think outside the box. And folks tended to say that, and then I would do that until I got a little too far outside the box, and then they say, well, get back in the box. So the thing I really appreciate about being in the private sector now is that when people say, hey, feel free to be creative and go do something different and think outside the box, they really mean it for the most part. And so I appreciate that now. And I guess I like that least about being in law enforcement.
Oh, very good. All right. Next on the line is Jamie. Jamie, what's your question for Joe?
Hey, Jason and Joe. I have a question for Joe. Joe, what is your favorite hip hop or rap song? Go ahead and spit some bars for the listeners.
Oh, Jamie. No way, Jamie. Wow. I want to rock right now. I'm Rob Mason. I came to get down. I'm not internationally known, but I'm known to rock the microphone. I did that song one time at a conference, Jay, and we were doing karaoke, and Sam Gwynn said to me, have you ever even heard that song? It sounded so good.
I do remember that because you were practicing, and I was trying to help you like make sure you got the lyric right as you were practicing because it's fast.
Yeah, it was terrible. What can I say?
All right, next on the line is Kevin. Kevin, what's your question for Joe?
Joe Ryan, how are you, buddy? So back in our days at Haida, we used to have a question that I believe you answered yes to, and I want to know if it still holds true today. You're standing on the 20-yard line. On the end zone is Ray Lewis. I'm going to give you the ball and blow the whistle. Are you going to score? And that can be either Joe Ryan in his prime against Ray Lewis in his prime, or Joe Ryan now versus Ray Lewis now. What do you got?
Oh, man, Ray Lewis. How many arguments did we have about Ray Lewis? Was he a murderer? Was he not a murderer?
Oh, just a number of arguments. We had that lunch bunch going on there where we would just debate all kinds of stuff.
I'm a huge fan of Ray Lewis, okay? Uh, there's no way I'm ever scoring a touchdown on Ray Lewis. In fact, the thought of being 20 yards away from Ray Lewis scares me to death. Just listening to one of his motivational speeches gets me fired up. So, yeah, big Ravens fan, big Ray Lewis fan. I ain't scoring on him.
I was thinking about this. Definitely, like in a prime, no way. No way. Me in my prime, him in his prime, 20 yards, that's too much space. I mean, obviously, that's what he did for a living, is just honed in on somebody and tackled him.
Yeah,
Today,
talk about in your prime. The people don't know this, but back in the day, you and I had the race in our dress shoes in the parking lot at the Washington Baltimore Heights, and I blew you away, and you couldn't handle this. So you waited till a conference 15 years later when I was out of my prime, and you wanted a rematch. Where were we?
Where was it? Was it
I want to say Florida, somewhere. Anyway,
yeah.
You blew me away. I tore a hamstring.
Chicago? It might have been Chicago. Yeah, I don't know, but it's well, definitely, yeah, we did the race in the parking lot. Kevin told that story when I had him on the show, and then yeah, we did. I do remember re-racing a couple years ago. So like, yeah, today, I mean, if Ray Lewis can barely walk now, maybe I have a chance now, but definitely not in our prime. Holy cow! No, thank you. All right. So next on the line is Joe. Joe, what's your question for Joe?
Hey, Joe. It's Joe Ryan, the fourth, part B. I had a quick question for you. What's your favorite mapping software? Holla at your boy.
I mean, I used Esri for so long, and I think the Esri suite is the best out there, right? In fact, I don't even know that anything's competing against it lately. And I think one of the things that goes a long way for crime analysts is having Chris Delaney and John Beck represent Esri, right? They get what we do. They're at every event. They're very approachable. I just saw a post on the forum the other day on IECA and somebody saying, hey, we're about to implement this. And Chris is like, well, call me if you need help. Just two great guys who are always there to assist. Stacy Belladin from a training perspective. So you got to go with Esri, I think, if you're in the crime analysis field, 100%.
All right. Yeah. And all right. Last caller is also Joe. Joe, what's your question for Joe?
Yeah, this is the real Joe Ryan. Michael, Jason, my question is, when you have an intersection, first corner of First and Main, why can't that be geocoded? Why haven't the professionals figured this out? It's really jacking up our data, and we usually just dump those for analysis purposes. What do you think about that, Michael?
I'll tell you what, I haven't had to think about geocoding for a long, long time. And I like that I don't have to think of geocoding. Geocoding was always one of those things that was so tricky. And then trying to design, like when I was over IT in Jacksonville, trying to figure out how to build an entry form for officers that ensured that the address would be good enough, but then be able to account for anomalies, right? Mm-hmm. That was always the trickiest thing, but I don't know, man. I'm not even dealing with geocoding anymore. So thankfully we do map in our solution right now, but we use the Google geocoder, which I think does a better job with intersections. Yeah. But more importantly, if you're confused by the Michael, my real name is Michael Joseph Ryan IV. And most people, I would say 40% of the people that email me started with, hey, Ryan. I don't know why. I don't correct them. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, I think people get confused. It was funny. There was a guy who had the last name of Kathy, and everybody would say, hey, Kathy, and then start from there. So it was always a joke at that office. But yeah, so it is appropriate. And we have the video on, and you have in the background there, you have a plaque that says Michael Joseph Ryan the fourth. So it's actually, yes, yeah, I can see that. It's very appropriate. I
know I got my Alexandria photo with the Alexandria cruiser. There's a little bit of a glare on it. Yeah. And then something from the Haida here, and then this is Sheriff Rutherford in Jacksonville. So yeah, a lot of memories.
Yeah, no, you have quite a career. So that is Ask Joe. So thank you to all the callers that called in. All right, Joe, let's finish up with personal interest. And for you, you are a podcaster as well, and you talk about pool.
Yeah. So Jay, I don't know that you know this, but you kind of inspired me to start a podcast. So I played competitive pool from a young age. My dad taught me when I was like 5 years old, and I've always been a avid pool player. And during times where I lived in the DC area, especially, I was single for a while. I got out and played in a lot of competitive tournaments. So I'm right on the edge of like semi-pro, you'd call it,
Mm-hmm.
like top amateur player. And I realized that if I asked you today, Jason, who's the best pool player in the world, you'd have no idea. You'd probably say something ridiculous like Minnesota Fats. It was like 50 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's a problem, right?
Mhm.
It's like you have done, I would assume you're doing this podcast to promote the industry, promote the profession,
Yes.
and promote the people who play a big role in that.
Mhm.
And after seeing what you were doing, I was like, I need to do that for pool. So I started something called the Pool Player Podcast, and I interview professional pool players from throughout the world so that they can get more exposure, more notoriety, and really make the game more popular. And so I started out with about 30 of those where I would interview the top players, and it was really rewarding, time consuming. A lot of people don't realize like how many hours goes into like this episode that you and I are recording, right?
Yeah.
There's the preparation, there's the pre-call, there's the editing afterwards. You're probably putting 15, 20 hours into a 1 hour episode, right? So one thing we kind of adapted, a partner and I started doing a podcast called Dogging It.
Yeah.
We call it Dogging It, a pool player podcast. And it's me and my buddy. And we do a lot of like live shows now where you don't have to worry about editing.
Yeah.
And we put it out there on YouTube and Facebook. And the idea is to stay abreast of current events, still interview players, but more around the current event, right? So starting this Saturday is the Moscone Cup, the biggest event of the pool year. So we start talking to the players, interviewing them, doing things like that. So it's been a blast. It's been a lot of fun. I haven't had a ton of time for it lately, though, because all three of my kids are athletes. So my two boys play soccer. I have a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old. I'm actually about to head to one of their games right now. And then my daughter's 11 and she's a gymnast. And as a parent, there's nothing more rewarding than watching your kids go out there and experience life lessons, winning, losing, crying, cheering, like all the emotions that come with it. I think if I didn't play sports when I was younger, I wouldn't have turned out to be successful as I've been. I feel like that's important. And so I spend most of my weekends out with the kids. And so yeah.
Yeah, that's great, and glad you get the time to do that and the time and, as you said, the flexibility.
Jay, one other thing. I'm also we're Christian family, so I volunteer with the youth group on Sunday nights. I work with middle school kids, and every Sunday night, just in perfect honesty, at 5:30 when it's time to go there, I don't want to go. I'm like, why did I sign up for this?
Yeah.
And by 8:30 when I come back home, I'm like, I'm so glad I did this because you're pouring into the life of these kids, which can make a huge difference in their life. And they have real problems, even at 12, 13 years old. And if I can speak to them and I can help guide them a little bit, I feel like that's adding a lot of value. So
yeah, no, I can understand that being rewarding, and it is funny that how that happens to me on just normal stuff, like, oh, I don't really want to go do this, and then I just end up having a great time and glad that I went. So yeah, I get the feeling. I do have two very specific questions in terms of pool for you.
Okay.
So you've obviously interviewed a lot of pool players, and one of your questions I think was a regular question is tell the time, and I forget the wording how you put it, but basically how you were swindled, right? You were at a bar, you start playing, you start betting for money, and then the person showed their true colors and just whooped on you. And so it's interesting to me to think about this because it doesn't, I mean, I think in terms of other sports and activities such as this, there's not necessarily this gambling aspect of it or this idea of meeting in a public place and having this happen to you. So I'm kind of curious about this whole idea of pool players, and do they all go through this where at one point in time that they were bamboozled?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of this dichotomy where the interesting stories revolve around gambling and crazy things that have happened. And so people want to hear that. But then I also have this thought that we need to clean pool up. It needs to be a more professional sport. I mean, sure, we know Phil Mickelson and Tiger Woods gamble,
Hmm.
right? But it's not considered backroom shady like pool is.
Hmm.
Whenever I tell somebody I play pool, the first thing they say is, "Oh, you're a pool hustler." You know, the
Yeah.
same way when you tell somebody you're a crime analyst, they go, "Oh, CSI." And you're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
"No,
No,
not at
no, no,
all."
no, no.
And so I do ask that question sometimes just because I know the audience has an interest in listening to it.
Hmm.
But what we're finding is that there's less and less of that going on. And I think the internet has been crucial to that. So it used to be that you could travel the country dressed in a painter's uniform, like wearing all white with paint all over you, walk into any pool hall, be the best player in 5 states, and then
Yeah.
just play some money and take all their money. Well,
Yeah.
now everybody knows everybody. And if they don't, it's a text message away or it's an internet search
Yeah.
away. And so there's no more anonymity when it comes to gambling and pool. So what we're finding now in more what we call two-man tournaments or matchups. So like if you're a good player and I'm a good player, we negotiate a game together and Jason and I meet somewhere and play for $30,000 and the winner
Yeah.
take all, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's helping to clean up the image in pool. And I'm all about promoting that good image in pool. So that's the things I like to highlight. But those gambling stories are fun, Jay. There's
Yeah.
some crazy ones out there. We call it getting air barreled.
Okay,
Okay.
that's what it was. Yes.
Yeah. You play somebody and let's say you play them for $200 and you beat them and they pay you 200 and they say, let's play again. And that second set, you beat them again. And they're like, oh, I don't have any money. That's called an air barrel.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's happened to me for one time, $1,200, one time,
Yeah.
$600. But what are you going to do? I'm not going to
Yeah.
fight somebody for it.
Yeah.
So basically, you're just out. You can't call the police.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're just out the money. So
Yeah. My other question, and this is a good follow-up to that, because you're talking about the professionalism of pool. And you and I have played pool. You know that I'm not very good, but I will say this: the best pool that I've ever played happened to be also the time when I was training for a marathon or running, and I was extremely flexible. I was like had the best flexibility of my life going through this training regimen, and I happened to then be playing pool during that time, and I played the best pool that I had. I had eyesight, getting down on the stick and whatnot. So I'm curious to, as the profession takes off, you also have this idea of training, not only just playing, but getting the body ready.
I'm glad you asked that, Jason, because that also has a nexus for anything you do, right?
Hmm.
And I feel like even as a crime analyst or a salesman or whatever, you have to take care of your body. And what we're seeing is that years ago in pool, Minnesota Fats was named Minnesota Fats, not because he had a workout regimen. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So the kind of the stereotypical pool player in the US tended to be a little overweight, ate a lot of bar food, a lot of fry foods,
Hmm.
didn't work out. And what happened is over the years, they have this big competition that's happening coming up. It's called the Moscone Cup. The United States plays Europe. It's not really fair, a country against a continent, but hey, whatever. And the United States used to dominate that because pool was big here. Well, when Europe started playing pool, they started training pool as a sport. So
Yeah.
they would eat well, they would work out in the mornings, they would play pool and train. And all of a sudden, Europe started playing better than the United States. So now they dominate that competition. Okay. I think there's something to be said for, I always say, look good, feel good, play good. Feeling good is a big part of that. And it's the same way in your daily job, whatever you do, if you're taking care of your body, you're going to do better. So I don't know that the flexibility necessarily helped you play the best, but probably that you were feeling good inside. There were tournaments that I used to play, and I remember just like being frustrated and down and emotionally not well, and I didn't play well. And then there were times where I'd go out to that tournament and I'd say, you know what? No matter what happens, I'm going to enjoy myself and have fun.
Yeah.
And when you go out and you change your mindset, and it's like anything in life, you change your mindset to a more positive mindset, then all of a sudden I'd win the tournament, even if I hadn't practiced. So I think taking care of your body, taking care of your health is good for sports and athletics, even though pool isn't really a sport. We'll call it a game.
I was trying to be careful there.
Yeah, it's also good for if you want to be the best crime analyst you can be. Like taking care of your body is a big part of that.
Yeah. All right, Joe. Hey, I really appreciate all the time here today. We're really running over. Before we get to Words to the World, I do just want to say I've often talked about you and Kevin Armstrong and how you were the art and science and just great mentors to me. And not that you couldn't do the science and he couldn't do the art, but I just thought that you were just one of the two greatest duos that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And I do want to thank you for the opportunity all those years back in 2001, giving me the opportunity for that internship. You probably didn't know it at the time, but I certainly was going through a lot personally and really trying to find my way. And I was lost and didn't know really where I belong. And you certainly helped me get on the track to where I am today. So I thank you.
Jason, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure kind of watching you progress throughout your career. And when you think about it, when you came and approached me, the price was right. So I couldn't say no. But I've made a lot of good hires over the years. I've made a lot of bad hires. But seeing you come in, you weren't really a hire, you were an intern, but then go into the analyst role. And now seeing you do keynote speeches and this podcast, it's really been a pleasure because I take a little bit of pride in that. Even though you've done all the work, I'm like, hey, I found this guy. He found me, whatever. I didn't ignore the email. So thank you for saying that, Jason. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor.
Yeah. All right. So if those that want to contact you, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah. So email joe@multitudeinsights.com. It's pretty easy. In fact, when I started there and I share my email with you, didn't you tell me, did you take this job so you could just have a Joe at email?
Yes. Yeah, that's what I did. I did say that.
That is a cool perk.
Yeah. You're the only Joe there?
That comes with being employee number 7 or whatever.
All right. Very good, Joe. Well, our last segment of the show is Words to the World. This is where you can promote any idea that you wish. Joe, what are your words to the world?
Hey, look, I think I look back at my career and I've had success. And I think about like, why have I had success? And I look at my skills and attributes and like, what was it that I could point a finger to and say, this helped me get by, this helped me advance. And the one thing that I keep going back to is treating people well. So when I started at the Washington Baltimore Haida, I was there for like 3 months. And Jeff Gersh decides he's going to leave and take a new job. And during those 3 months, I did the best job I could of just being kind to people, being nice to people, being helpful. And at the end of that, I got promoted into his role. Did I deserve it? Probably not. Was I qualified for it? Definitely not. But I treated people well, or I tried to the best I could. When I went to Alexandria, I did the same thing. When I went to Jacksonville, I just tried to treat people well. And to me, that is like the biggest thing that if you add that to what you do already, and if you already have that, great. But if you don't, if you just treat people well, things tend to turn out for you. Good things tend to happen for you. And I think people underestimate that. I see all the time within departments, within companies, people wanting to fight and argue or, I can't stand this person, I can't stand that person. But if you just change a little bit and you treat people well, golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated, you'd be surprised at the opportunities that would come to you. So I think that's something important. I know I'm going to try to continue doing that. And I'm thankful that it's worked out for me so far.
Very good. Well, I leave every guest with you. Give me just enough to talk bad about you later. But I do appreciate you being on the show, Joe. Thank you so much. Happy holidays, and you be safe.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.